In this writing exercise, we're going to be talking about economy of expression. And what I mean by that is we're going to focus on developing a scientific writing style. Particularly in APA format or in most social sciences, you're going to be using a scientific writing style in your papers. So what that means is that your voice has to have that more academic tone or formal tone to it. It means that it's not creative or expressive. You might have been taught to use descriptive language in a lot of your English writing courses. And in here, in this type of style, you don't want to use that sort of flowery language. Also, your voice shouldn't be non-conversational, meaning it shouldn't sound like you're talking, and that you should be using an active voice throughout papers. Also, there's no first-person narrative in most academic papers in the social sciences, and particularly in psychology. In this style of writing, you don't need textual evidence like you would in a literature course or some place where you need to provide the exact word-for-word context from a book or a piece. So, for example, in Great Expectations, you might want to, in a literature class, to provide a passage from that from that book. But in this case, what you'll be doing is not using textual evidence, but you'll be using and paraphrasing research from empirical papers in order to provide support for your main points. Of course, you'll use the basic elements of grammar, sentence construction, paragraph organization, etc., just like you would in any writing assignment or writing task. In particular, in scientific writing, the goal is to be as succinct, concise, precise, and to be as frugal with your words as you can be. I know that kind of is redundant right there, and there are a lot of words to basically say a couple of main things. Be precise in your words. Don't over explain or over describe what you're trying to say. We can kind of break down economy of expression into two parts. On one hand, you can think of it like your goal is to omit needless words. This is from the Elements of Style and Shrunken White. If you've taken your English 101 class, you might have had this handy resource for you about how to write. And what they say in that text is omit needless words. You don't need a lot of phrases, clauses, or words to explain a point. And then APA suggests it this way. Say only what needs to be said. Know your message, focus on your main point, avoid wordiness, avoid redundancy, keep your writing simple and readable. So always kind of keep these two phrases in mind as you're writing. Are there needless words in your writing? And are you only saying what needs to be said? Some examples of needless words or clauses that I typically see in student writing. So on one hand, you could see that with the exception of, there's 4 words there, right? And you could simplify that by just saying except, or in a hasty manner. You could just use an adverb and call it hastily. Or despite the fact that. Again, it could be simplified in just one word to say although, or I see this a lot in student papers. The reason being that is very typical. And it can be very colloquial, and this is how we talk, but the better way to say that is to just say because. Or whether or not. Well, it doesn't really matter if you have an or not, it's still contingent. So the word whether can be most effective in this situation, and it removes those needless words. And you can also think of it like removing needless words or clauses. So I'm going to give you a second to read this little passage here. And as you're reading it, I want you to think of a couple of things. What's important? What's the main idea? If you look at this passage, what words can you omit? And is it succinct, concise, precise, or frugal? So your goal is to look at this little passage and think about what you would take out so that the main idea still comes across. There's a lot of extra words here, and I would like to suggest that you can pretty much get rid of most of it. Because the main point of this passage is just that older adults volunteer more as they age. The rest of it is superfluous. It's not helping you to make a point, and it's just adding words, basically, and explaining what the title of the article is. Well, a reader can find that in your references. They don't need that in your paper. So even though probably along the line you've been taught that you need to reach a certain word count or to be as descriptive as you can be, we're going to shift that goal somewhat so that it's not about reaching a certain word count, but reaching a certain conciseness, preciseness in your writing. So one way you can do this to kind of help yourself is to use that narrative citation so that you can have your writing flow a little bit better and be a little bit more succinct and clear. So start with the author's last name and use that narrative citation. So probably the best revision that I could think of, and I'm sure there are others, it's not one perfect one, would be to add the author's last name, the citation, the year of publication, and then you have a complete sentence and a complete citation, and you're all set. So another way to think of that is how to make language more concise in general. So that was an example where we could omit specific words and clauses. So now I want you to think about, well, how do I think about a particular sentence and making that more concise? So I'll give you a second to read this original passage, and then I want you to think about the same question. What's the important or main idea? What words can you can omit? And is it concise, and how can you make it more so? And ultimately what we're trying to do is distill down to the basic elements, what's the main point? And so here's one suggestion for a revision for clarity. So this original passage is basically saying that adolescents could be, maybe, more depressed or anxious when we're not in a pandemic, or when they are able to go to school. So there could be a couple of ways that you could revise that. Number one, the first part of the sentence is a clause. And it gives us some information, but it can be used to help us to clarify and write a little more succinctly. So here's my suggestion. Adolescents may be more depressed and anxious during the pandemic. Well, that's very specific and clear. Okay. Another one is adolescents may be more depressed and anxious because of the changes of daily routines during the pandemic. It kind of gets a little bit more to that idea about how school might be related to that or daily routine. So it adds that element to it. But you can see there's fewer words and it's more direct. So a couple of hints in terms of just whenever you are writing something or as you're writing to think about a couple of things. Avoid clauses. So an example of a clause is being that we were in a pandemic. Well, that's a clause and it could be taken out. It's just adding words that are unnecessary. And then avoid passive voice. And in the example here, when it starts, any ing verb kind of is a signal, not always, but is a signal that it could be in passive voice. So think about how you could rewrite that so it's not in passive voice, so that your verbs are ending in ed if it's in past tense or in present tense. But making sure that you're not using that ing form. So being that we're in a pandemic, that's a passive voice. So the way you can change that is to see if you can change the voice of that statement altogether. Ultimately, there are a few goals of using economy of expression, and it happens to be something that I look at in terms of writing and student writing to see if they are developing this skill. They're not using a lot of words. They're being clear. they're to the point, they're concise and succinct. This isn't to say that you are not using words because it's easier. It's because you're trying, in fact, using economy expression can be really difficult and really challenging to help you to say something or make a point that you want to make by being as clear as you possibly can. As you're revising your papers, you ought to go back and look through to see if you've used economy of expression. Most people will write through a paper, and that's great, but the important step is to go back and look to make sure that you're being clear and concise with your words. Thank you so much.